Hey everyone, welcome back to The Great Retention with Kamber Parker, sponsored by the YoProKnow. I'm Kamber, founder and CEO of the YoProKnow, where we bring you strategies to cultivate a dynamic and multi-generational workforce where all generations thrive. Whether you're looking to enhance cross-generational communication or secure your company's future with dedicated professionals, we have you covered at YPK. Today, I am so excited to have Katy Smith, Executive Director at Greater Good Greenville, join us here in Greenville, South Carolina. She is a seasoned business leader with nearly 30 years of experience in community engagement, nonprofit collaboration, and social sector strategy. Her team at Greater Good Greenville specializes in connecting nonprofits, philanthropic funders, and mission-minded entities to collaborate on shared goals and maximize their impact on our community. Our team had the opportunity to work with Greater Good Greenville and continues to do so this year through our Vote GVL efforts, an initiative to encourage voter turnout in local elections. Our side of that coin is really looking at how do we get that next generation of voters, and their side of the coin, which we can talk about later, is really getting employers in the broader community to encourage their employees to get out to vote. That's been a really cool project. So Simple Civics is a podcast designed to educate about local government and motivate individuals to get involved. So I knew that her thoughts on local politics and community engagement would be fascinating and insightful. Katy, welcome to the show.
Kamber, thanks so much for having me. This is a real privilege.
I am just so excited to have you because, for many years, up until we had the privilege of really starting to work together this year in 2024, I had always heard about you in the community. And I just know that you've always done amazing things and big things. And so I'm really excited that our audience gets to hear more about the efforts that you have going on today. So to get started, we're going to start with what I like to call a lightning round. So in a couple of sentences or less, try to answer these questions. So first up, what is something that is not on your resume?
I love cartooning.
Okay.
And I don't even know if many of my friends know this, but I was always kind of like the amateur cartoonist in my school growing up and would make commentary on various school activities and like local politics, which were about like school lunch and things like that. And I still love the way humor helps give a different perspective on things and opens up our minds. I don't really do it anymore, but I feel like I should again.
I was going to say that could maybe align with some of the topics we're even talking about today. That is so cool. Well, I hope if any of your friends are listening, they learned something new about you. What's the most impactful book that you have read?
It was definitely the book Essentialism by Greg McKeown, I think is how you say his last name. I feel like I need to reread it once a year because it just helps you pare back to what is most important in your work, in your personal life, et cetera. I'm really great for having a bigger plate time-wise than my stomach in terms of capacity. And so it's a great book to help you kind of pare back and focus on what's most essential.
Great. We love good book tips on this show. What is your preferred style of communication at work?
So I do like email because it feels most efficient, although sometimes I hear my fingers clicking way too long and writing way too long of an email. But in person is great just to help build relationships and trust, as long as you can be efficient and essential with it.
Yeah, I'm always amazed at just the variety of responses I get when I ask that question in the lightning round.
And you've taught me a lot about it in terms of intergenerational workplaces.
Yeah,
so I'm trying to get better.
That's our number one, conversation that people always want to hear more about. And it's really quite simple when we kind of get down to the root of it. But it's a conversation for another day.
Yes.
So last lightning round question. What was the first election that you voted in?
It was 1990, so I'm in my early 50s, and I was a sophomore in college, and I went to college in North Carolina, but was a Florida resident, so voted absentee by mail, and was so excited, and then realized I don't know who the heck any of these people are on the ballot other than governor, which is still a common experience of many young voters today.
It is, and we're going to talk a lot more about that, but thank you for that. We typically do not ask that of our guests, but for today's purpose and the topic, it is super relevant, so thank you for sharing. I guess you never forget your first voting experience. So let's dive right in for kind of the meat of our conversation today. So by the time that this episode airs, we will be weeks, if not days, away from the election here in 2024. You don't work in politics per se, but voting is a major part of community engagement, as we kind of alluded to in the introduction. And it's no secret that galvanizing young professional participation in elections is a constant topic of concern. From your perspective, what motivates younger generations to vote? And have you observed any differences in the priorities of young voters compared to experienced generations when it comes to community-focused issues?
Yeah. What's interesting is the same things that motivate older voters are the same that motivate young voters. There's some really interesting research out of Michigan State University that looks at voters and their drives, and it's really altruism, a sense of voting on behalf of another group that you care about. It is a sense of duty, that this is the kind of person who I am and voting is congruent with my values. And it's a sense of belonging, that this is an activity that people that are like me also do. And so that's true across the board. You can imagine, though, for a young voter, when they're thinking about what kind of causes are they altruistic about, they might be different than an older group, or the groups that they belong to might be having different conversations than older people. Issues-wise, I think a lot of people assume that young voters are very animated by things like abortion or Second Amendment or gun control or climate. That is all very true and part of the conversation. But lots of polls show that the economy is the most important thing to young voters. And that is because, of course, they're entering the workplace with huge student debt, more than any other generation. They're not getting paid as much as older generations, which has always been the case for a generation entering the workforce. And we have a really difficult housing market for them. So they are very animated about the economy, just like everybody else, but might have different twists on policy. And that's true locally, too. I mean, they are as concerned about growth as older generations are, but they're thinking about it very much from housing, from schools that their kids might go to, and the like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really fascinating. And, when I think about economy being the number one factor, that's really interesting to me. And of course, the local data that we got earlier this year together, we understood that that was one of the top motivating voting policies, right, for younger generations. But I'm interested in this because I think of life stages, right? And I think of these are, people who are entering the workforce, they have a long life ahead of them. And so if the economy is not strong and they're looking for candidates who are going to be able to help achieve some of those financial goals in the next 40 years of their careers, that's going to play a big part. And also, not even mentioning housing, right? And thinking of the fact that, millennials and Gen Zers are staying at home longer with their parents because they can't afford homes. Like all of these factors really do contribute. It, of course, extends beyond the workplace. So we're going to talk a lot more about that. But thank you so much for kind of opening us up in that conversation with those really great facts. With your podcast, Simple Civics, Greenville County, and through your previous work as executive director of multiple organizations focused on community engagement and philanthropy, in what ways have you seen young leaders and professionals actively participating in shaping policy and community engagement? And what insights have you gained about the role of young people in shaping local governance and civic involvement?
It is always such a delight to see younger people get involved in any way in community. Whether it's serving on a board or volunteering with a nonprofit or donating, whatever that is. Oftentimes, that is the entry point that people decide to get more involved in local government and politics because they see something at a nonprofit they're interested in or in their workplace, and they think, why is it like that? And then they take it to the next level with city or county government. It is really a delight to see it, but it is really challenging for folks to get involved. I go to almost every single Greenville County Council meeting, and I am often one of the younger people in the room, which tells you something. Seldom do you see young people, but when they are there, you can see county council members take notice and kind of give them a different bit of attention. And so I really think just showing up is a way to get involved, but joining a board, joining a commission, it really freshens up the conversation, it lends new perspective, and then those folks can be a introducer to their friends and colleagues to get involved as well.
You mentioned that it is challenging, like there are barriers. Can you describe some of those barriers?
Yeah. So, let's just talk about voting, which to me is the most important, but also the most basic way to get engaged. If you are young, first of all, where you even live is you're in kind of a fluid time, right? So you register to vote based on where you live. If you are just out of college, you still identify with your home, wherever that might be. You're not yet connected to your community. You're renting. You're not really plugged in yet. And so it's a little difficult for folks. I have a child, an adult child who just graduated college and lives in New York City, but she still considers herself a South Carolinian. So it's challenging for her to know how to plug in and how to begin to get involved. Then when you think about those next layers of volunteerism or board service or public board service, like on a board or commission, it's a challenging process to navigate. It's sometimes dependent on who you know. And when you're young, you might not know people who can introduce you in those ways. And everyone is very busy, but I think you're particularly time constrained when you're young. You might be working a lot of extra hours. You might have young children that rely on you that make it hard to get out in the evening for a meeting. So I do think there are a lot of barriers, but there are ways we can make the process more welcoming for young people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are really amazing points and ones that I might not have even thought of. Like location, absolutely. If you're kind of like, maybe in between these two locations, which I certainly was like that in my early career. So really interesting point.
Can I drill down on it?
Absolutely.
One more, the other thing regarding your kind of fluidity of residence when you're young, especially with local elections, candidates have a really limited budget. And so they are more likely to reach out to likely voters. They're going to spend their money to turn out people who have voted before to vote again. If you are new in a community, you don't have a voting record to tap into. If you're a renter, your residence isn't established as, oh, this person usually comes out for primaries. And so no money is spent sending you postcards or putting signs near your house or knocking on your door, which means unless you're following local news media, which I know we'll talk a little bit more about, you might not even be aware something's going on. So that's another barrier, is just that information.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. So generally speaking, motivation to vote and participate in community engagement is usually strongest when we talk about the federal level, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about the upcoming election, but often local involvement can make the biggest day-to-day impact when we're voting at that local level. So in your opinion, how do we reach younger generations to actually mobilize them at a local level? And how do we get them to engage beyond voting? So I know we kind of touched on that last question there a moment ago, but really looking at that federal versus local impact and getting people to show up for the local elections.
Yeah. I mean, I just firmly believe that local government is in many ways more important than federal government in our day-to-day lives. That's potholes, that's schools, that's the things that bug us or excite us on a day-to-day basis. But until you've really had a reason to engage with it, it's hard to recognize its relevance. I do think that's why there's such a higher voter turnout among older adults. In part, their lives are different, but they've had years of experience of what does bad zoning do to you, or what does poor funding for roads or schools mean to your family or to your kids. So I do think it can help younger voters by having really intentional outreach. A lot of that is the great work you all are doing with Vote GVL. It's kind of infusing yourself into places where young people are, which is often social media, to call to their attention the importance of these things that they might not otherwise know about. I also think workplaces are a great way to begin to expose folks to the importance of local and state issues too, just by lifting up how interconnected it is and helping them plug in by boards, commissions, and the like.
Yeah, and let's talk about workplaces, because I know that has been a really big push for Greater Good Greenville this year. So when we talk about that, I think historically it's, we don't talk politics in the office. It's not what we do. Although I think that's really changed in the last few years, and we're going to talk a little bit more about rhetoric. But what do you say to employers that might be hesitant to, encourage voting across the board?
Yeah. I mean, some of the biggest things that affect whether a person votes, aside from those motivations, are things like access, a sense that my vote will have an impact, and a sense that I'm part of community, which is that belonging that we talked about. So if employers can do things like build access to a vote or to participating on a board or commission or the like by giving time off, letting people know how important it is, that can really make a difference. And you don't have to say who to vote for. You can just say, we believe your civic duty is important. It's important to us as a company. Letting people know the impact that their vote has on decisions around taxes or policy, whatever it may be, and creating a sense of community in the workplace that this is who we are and this is what we do, can really help drive someone to be engaged in a different way.
Absolutely. And can you talk really briefly about what y'all did earlier this year for the primary election and what that process looked like for companies to kind of pledge that they were going to get 100% participation for their employees?
Yeah, we were so proud earlier this year to have a campaign called Voting Matters, which continues now in the general, but it was really focused on the primary because our primary turnout is terrible in the state of South Carolina. And that is when most of our candidates are chosen because they might have an opposition in the primary, but not in the general election. So we encouraged employers to help get the word out to their employees about deadlines to register, about how to get educated about candidates, about going and actually voting. we did see, and it was a lot of factors that combined, but we did see turnout increase 3 percentage points in the primary and in the runoff, which is a trend in the right direction for sure.
Absolutely. Always room for improvement in this space, but that was the goal, right? Was to increase it. So, congratulations to your team.
Right back at you.
So thank you. So we had talked about social media a moment ago, but just looking at, your experience and observing how access to information has evolved over time, do you think the accessibility of information through social media has influenced the young professionals' voting behavior?
Yeah, I 100%. It's influenced everybody's voting behavior, including young professionals.
I was hoping you would say that.
Yes, everyone's behavior is affected. So lots of research shows that older generations, including my own, Gen X, gets our information mostly from legacy media, from watching the nightly news or from reading the newspaper or magazines, and younger generations gets it far more from social media. That does not mean that either of those contents are better. It's very fractured in social media space. People can tend to be in an echo chamber. There's a lot of misinformation out there on all fronts for sure. But the great thing about social media in terms of getting young people engaged is it does infuse it in their life where they are. So whereas as an older voter, I might have to go turn on a TV channel to watch it and learn more about it, or pick up a newspaper or look at it on my phone and seek it out. Social media just puts it in there in the midst of your TikTok scroll while you're looking at recipes or fights or whatever it is that you're excited about. So you are picking up information that you might not otherwise find. And it does create that sense of belonging. So you have a community on social media that is kind of your tribe, for better or for worse. And if you see that your tribe is engaging in local government or voting or whatever it may be, you're going to say, oh, this is who I am too, so I want to take part.
Yeah.
It has two sides to it, but it does definitely. In fact, we are seeing that younger generations are voting at higher rates than ever before. Still, they're the smallest, but it's ticking upwards.
Yeah, it's way more. And I think you painted a nice picture of both sides there. And something that I really want to touch on, two things actually. You mentioned tribe. Word of mouth referrals is pretty powerful for this younger generation, and we see that in the form of social media. So just in the last couple of weeks, for example, we had Hurricane Helene, devastate the Carolinas, and you were really easily able to see kind of where people stand on some of the recovery efforts and some of the misinformation that we're starting to see kind of pop up, and based on who's resharing what. And you start to see just in your general social media tribe, right? Like who is engaging in certain content. Like that is a form of word of mouth referrals in a way.
Such a good point.
Which is, really, we could probably spend an entire hour talking about that. But the other thing I want to mention, just because it's very timely, is just this week alone, when we look at the national election, we're seeing a podcast frenzy, right? So I don't know if you've seen a couple of things, but there have been, both candidates have been on major podcast platforms, really aiming at that 18 to 24, 18 to 30 range. And it's pretty powerful. It's creating a lot of discussion. As somebody who consumes a lot of podcasts, and we both host podcasts, it has made me pause and really just say, is this the future of campaigning for a lot of candidates, both on the federal and local level? So I don't know if you have a comment about that.
Yeah, I think you are completely right, because I do think it's that sense of personal contact that is the biggest impact on someone voting. So I think there's research that shows if a candidate knocks on your door, or a candidate's campaign knocks on your door and shakes your hand and introduces themselves, that is really going to drive your vote, especially on a local level, because you go and you're like, I don't know who these county council people are, but this one came and met me, so he must be great. That podcast has the sense of creating that same sense of personal relationship. I mean, it's that celebrity idea that I feel like I know this person, even though we've never met. And I do think we're seeing some national candidates shift the way they're spending money, because they don't feel they need the ground game like they used to, because they have a deep personal connection through the airwaves with people.
Right.
It's really changing things. I totally agree.
Yeah, I mean, literally just the past 2 days. Like I actually thought it was a joke when I saw both candidates on some pretty, one might say like youthful influencer podcasts, which a lot of journalists have had a lot of interesting thoughts around that, because they're like, well, they don't have the same journalistic principles as we would. And so the reality is they have a voice in their audiences who historically do not show up to vote, or maybe they're undecided. And so I want to keep a pulse on that in the coming years because I think that's going to be really fascinating. And podcasts have just blown up.
Yeah. And it does make me think back to the second election I voted in, which was 1992 when Bill Clinton was on the ballot. It was a whole big thing at that time when he went on the Tonight Show with Jay Leno and played the saxophone. I think I have that right. Maybe it was Arsenio Hall.
Yeah.
But it kind of made him more relevant to young people because he was on a young platform. There were just so few options at that time for that. So maybe we're just seeing a long-time trend explode in a totally different way.
Yeah, again, really fascinating. We could be talking about that for a while, but in the interest of time, another common concern about voter behavior is rhetoric, right? We have seen, especially over the past decade, a major increase in charged language and heated rhetoric. What do you think are the factors that have caused this increase, and what advice do you have for turning down the volume in our political discourse?
Yeah.
I know it's a loaded question.
It is. I mean, the thing that troubles me is I don't really have great advice. I have some thoughts. I don't know if they're correct.
Yeah.
What I think has happened is that so much of our lives have moved online. And when we are online, we engage with each other in a way that we would never do in person. There's much more vitriol. There's much more depersonalization. And algorithms tend to reward vitriol and rage. And so movements are then created online that are filled with angry people that are depersonalized so that then candidates and people in the public eye shape themselves to that. And then it creates more vitriol in person as well. The only thing I can think of is for us to try to take time to unplug and engage with each other. And I do feel like our local community creates that opportunity because even though local policy might tend to have echoes of this national conversation, when we're getting together and solving problems about parks or trails or what happens in classrooms, hopefully we can look eye to eye and recognize differences but work together for common solutions.
Yeah.
And just getting together, playing cards, hanging out, having dinner. I like to think there's still hope in that.
Right. And it's a great answer. And I appreciated your kind of caveat at the beginning. Like, these are thoughts and they might not be right. I agree with them wholeheartedly. I think it's funny because we have talked a lot today about the impact of online and how it can be really powerful and put to good use. But of course, there are the big negative effects of an online campaign season and election. And I think, unfortunately, younger generations have only known this. So thinking of Gen Zers who have literally only been voting as long as this environment has kind of been the case. And so toning down the rhetoric, we're talking about the national election, but it happens on the local level too. I would say it certainly does.
You're exactly right. You are exactly right, Kamber. Yeah. And thanks for pointing out those generational differences too. Like the complete water that Gen Z and Alpha is swimming in is online.
Yeah.
So
it's new. It's very different from their parents' voting experiences and kind of initial voting experiences. So, thinking of kind of toning down the rhetoric, of course, this episode is going to air right before November 5th. And what advice would you give to employers who, are kind of listening to this, watching this, and are wondering, what is this week going to look like? So what advice do you have for those employers?
Gosh, I first of all would just encourage everyone to celebrate folks' engagement in civic life. Encourage people to vote just as you would. Celebrate that they have done so. Give them time to do so if you can. And I would imagine that feelings are going to be very sensitive post-election. And it may not be settled that whole full week of the general election, especially given Helene, especially given Milton. So I think just giving everyone patience and encouraging it among each other and helping people remember their values of hopeful respect for each other, but know that feelings are going to be tender. It'll be a tricky week, and I have some apprehension about it myself.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think there are any resources that companies can utilize? I mean, can they go online and are there resources they can kind of utilize that you offer? Or, are there maybe some team members like HR or other places? Like, who can they kind of lean on? Who can leaders lean on during this time?
It is something it's important for HR or for executive directors or CEOs to really be thinking about because feelings will be tender. You want your workforce to stay together and unified to get the job done and don't want politics to divide them. So there are lots of ways employers are thinking about it. Kamber, I know you all work with employers all the time to think through policies and procedures and just really healthy practices that people should be mindful of and getting in place now before the election.
Absolutely. And it's being proactive is kind of what I'm hearing. And so I think a great thing that we can do is maybe do a little bit of additional research and then put that in our show notes. I think that's a great suggestion. And I also just, something that I just thought of is, social media, right? We're thinking of the online usage of some of employers' employees, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that needs to be monitored, but I am kind of thinking of the employer here that you might want to be aware of some things that could be coming out across all channels over the next couple of weeks and months, to be transparent. So again, we'll put more resources out there, but thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, thanks, Kamber.
So let's talk about civic education,
Mm-hmm.
okay? We've talked a lot about just civic engagement today, but how important, and I think I know the answer to this, but do you think civic education is in motivating people to vote and engage with local politics, and what are some ways to improve that?
I, of course, yes, think it's deeply important. I think the tricky thing about it is best learned in practice. I think when you have something you are particularly following or interested in, that is when the lessons are most deeply known, which again is why I think older voters are much more likely to show up because they've personally experienced it. So I think the more for both young children, students in school, but young people and people of any age, if there are ways to create application that we either just show in abstract, like these roads are affected by your vote, or invite people to come and watch the civic process happen. Come to a city council meeting, come to a county council meeting. Blue Ridge High School often has a class that comes to every county council meeting each semester, and it's a delight to see these young people. And I think they're probably both partly bored, but they're also puzzled and intrigued.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the way I think when we see it in practice that we can best educate folks and get them engaged.
Absolutely. And I really liked what you said, honestly, earlier at the beginning of this episode about, how county council members do take note when younger people are in the room. And I think that's really powerful. But again, I just think of my own experience as a young professional and my peers. I know that no one's spent time doing that, right? Like I try to spend my time, in board involvements and doing as much as I can community oriented. But when it comes to that kind of county level, going to several meetings, I don't feel like that's something that's super well communicated to the next generation. So maybe something that could be maybe focused on a little bit more in future years. And I'm sure you would agree with that.
Yes, absolutely.
So kind of looking ahead and wrapping up our interview today, Katy, we're going to switch gears a little bit. So we talk a lot at the YoProKnow just about multi-generational teams, as you know. Your work is about partnering with nonprofits and other organizations across the region. So I imagine that you work with a wide variety of people across generations and even industries. So what tips might you have for successfully leading multi-generational teams? Again, you've had so much experience in a lot of different spaces over the years. So we would love to end knowing what your thoughts are there.
Yeah. Well, I have appreciated learning so much from you, Kamber, honestly, about different communication styles and just being open with each other about our different views and preferences in the workplace and recognizing that there is so much that I can benefit from giving enormous space to younger people, especially if we want to engage them. We need to understand what motivates them, what they're excited about, what kinds of activities they'd like to pursue. So for us, we just try to create a lot of space to build on the strengths that both older people and younger people that we work with, that they have to bring to the work. I think about our own small team. We have a baby boomer who just has such patience and warmth and grace and a way to connect with people of all generations that I'm rushing around that I don't sometimes bring to things. And then we have millennials on our team who are so efficient, know totally different processes we never would have thought of, view the world in a completely different way that opens our eyes and just changes the way we do things. So reminding myself of there are so many tools in our team's toolkit that we can tap into.
Yeah.
And I'll say a small thing that I'm trying to do is reminisce less. I find that I am now suddenly at the age where I'm like, well, when I was young, nobody really cares about that. I mean, maybe they do, but trying to be better to say, you know what, maybe that was relevant at one time, but there's some new ideas to listen to.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. And I do think, I think that reminiscing less is funny how you say that, because I do agree that sometimes that is the only thing that seasoned, experienced professionals are doing, right? Like when I was your age, we were doing it this way. Sometimes it can be a little too much, but I don't think that you should discount it completely, because I do believe that young professionals want to learn. I think it's the execution and how you are reminiscing, if that
That's
means
helpful.
anything.
Thanks for the coaching right here
but
on your podcast.
I love hearing that. I mean, it goes back to kind of why YoProKnow exists in the first place. It's generational data is powerful and it can help shape communication across your team and understanding. But being generationally aware is just half the battle. You got to understand your team, right? And it sounds like you do. You know who the people are on your team, but you know how they communicate, and it goes back. You have to go straight to the source, right, and talk to them. So I appreciate you sharing that you've learned from us, but we have certainly learned from you. And so before we wrap up today, Katy, I just want to make sure: is there anything that we haven't touched on that you want to end and share with our audience before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I think for people who are young who are listening, or people who care about people who are young, which I hope is everyone, just starting somehow to get civically engaged is the best place to start. Sign up to be on a nonprofit board. Raise your hand and apply to be on a public board or commission. Get engaged with a candidate's campaign on the local level who you care about and knock on doors. Just starting begins your own civic engagement journey, and the earlier you start, the more important your young voice will be in the process.
Absolutely. What a great way to wrap up our interview. Thank you so much for your time today, Katy.
Kamber, thanks so much for having me and for all that you do.
Absolutely. Before we wrap up today, just want to highlight a couple of key points from Katy's episode. Number one is the sense of belonging stems across all generations. And so when you're thinking as employers of just the narrative that you want to kind of bring to your workplace, belonging is where I would start. Number two is unplug and engage with each other as best as you can. Online in the digital world that we live in today, it can create a lot of divisiveness. And we're seeing that when it comes to both national and local elections. Celebrate the engagement in civic life over the next couple of weeks and the next couple of months. I think that's going to be critical in your workplaces. And then number four, encourage people to just start somewhere. Okay, that is a really great way to wrap up this episode. And I appreciate all of you for listening. Reach out. We're going to provide information to contact Katy and her team if you have any questions during this time. Thank you again for joining us today on The Great Retention. Before you go, remember this: the generational landscape is shifting, and the workforce as we know it is not the same workplace we knew in a pre-pandemic world. Our mission is to help you save time and money by identifying these shifts and demystifying generational differences through our training and speaking, consulting, and strategy work. Contact us today at YoProKnow if you're interested in transforming your multi-generational workforce, and let's drive your business towards long-term sustainability and success. And folks, again, we understand this might be a pretty sensitive time, so that is why we wanted to bring you this exclusive episode with Katy Smith of Greater Good Greenville. Again, feel free to reach out to her or our team for any further questions. Thanks again, and have a great day.